Hey everyone, my name's Amir, I'm a GSI in this class, and I'll be giving the lectures on Marx and Marxism this week. Before we begin, I want you to forget everything you know about Marxism and communism. For this class, we're going to be focused on the texts, on Marx and his thought. We don't want to hear anything about government control, Soviet-style communism, or tired cliches about how it only works in theory. So what is Marxism then? Well, there are three ways we can understand the term Marxism. The first is as a political ideology, which is what we're most familiar with, a set of principles that organize political action. The second is a theory of history, specifically an account of Western European history, which is what we'll be discussing in this module. Marx has a materialist theory of history. That means for him, history is not driven by ideas, but by material needs and the struggle for wealth. Finally, we can think of Marxism as a research methodology. This is one that I use, and one that takes fighting oppression as its starting point and is fundamentally action-oriented. It's important for us to consider that for Marx, political theory was not an idle exercise in an ivory tower. He famously wrote that hitherto philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. We should keep in mind that the Communist Manifesto was a document written for workers. It was a call to action, and therefore trades the nuance that characterizes Marx's other work for punchy language that is accessible to industrial workers. For that reason, it should not always be taken as indicative of Marx's thought elsewhere. It's helpful to think of Marx as telling us a story, or a historical narrative. In two words, what is this story? Class struggle. We are going to look at how Marx's theory explains the transition from feudalism to capitalism. This story will help us understand what capitalism is by placing it in its historical context. To understand this transition, it will be important for us to get to know the characters of the story, the four main classes whose actions drove the transition from feudalism to capitalism. I find it helpful to look at some examples from art history for this section. On the left, we have feudal aristocracy, lords and ladies, kings and queens. We can see Louis XVI, king at the time of the French Revolution, and Robert and Cersei from Game of Thrones. On the right, we have the peasants, depicted by Peter Bruegel the Elder and Monty Python. The relationship between these two classes is critical for the way we understand feudalism. To state the obvious, the aristocracy was the ruling class. They held their power and wealth in land. While peasants worked for lords, they didn't perform wage labor. Instead of being paid by the hour, they would often work a few days a week on the lord's land, or they would pay feudal dues to the lord based on their harvest. In exchange, the lords would provide protection to the peasants. Thus, peasants and lords had mutual obligations to each other. Critically, most peasants were not free to leave the land they worked, just as lords were not free simply to sell the land they governed. Thus, private ownership in land, as we understand it now, did not exist under feudalism. Under capitalism, things are a bit different. On the one hand, we have the bourgeoisie, depicted here by Rembrandt in the 17th century and by madmen in the 20th. The word bourgeoisie comes from the word bourg, meaning town. Think of the suffix of Hamburg or Pittsburgh. Whereas peasants and lords were rural classes, the bourgeoisie was an urban class, often merchants. They were comprised of shopkeepers, bankers, and manufacturers who lived in towns. Proletarians, unlike peasants, were not attached to a piece of land. They were free to sell their labor for wages. Of course, when Marx describes them as free labor, it is tongue-in-cheek, because if they don't sell their labor, they will starve. It is a choice that is no choice. And here on the slide, you can see them depicted by L.S. Lowry and by The Simpsons. So how do we get from feudal lords and peasants to bourgeois capitalists and proletarians? Well, it's a story we've been building to over the past few weeks. It's the transition from the medieval to the early modern to capitalist modernity. With large amounts of money coming into Europe from the colonies, and with new technologies that allowed agriculture to produce more food with fewer workers, the economic center of Western Europe began to shift from the countryside to the towns. Thus, the nascent bourgeoisie, profiting off the colonial trade and utilizing new technologies in manufacturing, gradually took economic power from the feudal aristocracy. Moreover, with fewer peasants needed to work farmland, they began moving to the cities, creating a new class of proletariats who had to sell their labor for a wage to make ends meet. Even with the economic power in the hands of the bourgeoisie, the feudal aristocrats still controlled the political system. This tension between the economic power of the bourgeoisie and the political power of the feudal aristocrats is articulated very nicely by Marx. He says, "The means of production and of exchange, on whose foundation the bourgeoisie built itself up, were generated in feudal society. At a certain stage, however, in the development of these means of production and of exchange, the conditions under which feudal society produced and exchanged, the feudal organization of agriculture and manufacturing industry, in one word, the feudal relations of production, became no longer compatible with the already developed productive forces of capitalism. Feudalism thus became so many fetters. They had to be burst asunder. They were burst asunder." Well, what is the bursting asunder? Revolution. It took revolution to overthrow the feudal aristocracy and inaugurate a state controlled by the bourgeoisie. We've already encountered two examples of these bourgeois revolutions, the English Civil War and the Great French Revolution of 1789. In both cases, we have a rising, wealthy, urban, merchant, bourgeois class who controlled the country's economic power but lacked a voice in government, which remained in control of the feudal aristocracy. This contradiction came to a head in both cases due to the monarch's incompetence. In England, this resulted in the bourgeois parliament overthrowing King Charles I. In France, the people of Paris overthrew Louis XVI. In both cases, the monarch was executed by the people. In the context of political theory, we see a shift from the divine right of kings that justified feudal governance to popular sovereignty, which justifies bourgeois liberal democracy. These bourgeois values were best exemplified in Locke, who, as we've seen, puts the defense of private property at the very center of his theory of sovereignty. So, what is capitalism? Capitalism is defined by what we may call certain laws of motion. Workers and bourgeoisie compete among themselves in a market. The workers compete for jobs, the bourgeoisie compete for profit. Competition demands not just profit, but an ever-increasing rate of profit. A stock's value will only increase if shareholders can expect more profit in the future. For this reason, capitalists must always be on the lookout for new ways to make money. This can be through innovation, but it can also be through greater exploitation and by finding new markets. The search for profit led to untold misery during the Industrial Revolution when Marx was writing. On the right, you can see literal children working as coal miners to make money for some capitalist. Recall that this is not how production was organized under feudalism. Feudal peasants did not compete with one another in a market. They produced for subsistence and to meet their dues to their lord. The imperative of market competition is distinctly capitalist. I want to emphasize that capitalism pressures the bourgeoisie to seek out new sources of profit. Listen to Marx's phrasing. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. This is why capitalism has spread across the whole world. It drove colonial expansion in search for markets and raw materials. The need for never-ending profit and growth is placed above all other human needs, resulting in horrible consequences like the exploitation we see above and runaway climate change. The constant search for new sources of profit means that capitalism is revolutionary. This makes it powerful, but it also leads to its downfall. Let's hear Marx again. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. Conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered forms was, on the contrary, the first condition of existence for all earlier industrial classes. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguished the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast, frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses the real conditions of his life and his relations with his kind. Old values are tossed to the wayside in favor of productive expansion. If an idea is no longer profitable, it is discarded. So, for example, if heteronormativity becomes a liability, then banks start sponsoring pride parades. Capitalism is progressive, but this progressivism comes at a cost. Whereas other modes of production could rely on a fixed tradition to sustain its ruling class, capitalism is constantly changing. Because its values are always changing, people are not as attached to them. Similarly, the very productive expansion of capitalism enables its downfall. How does it do this? First, the search for greater profit results in a race to the bottom for workers' living conditions. Wages are pushed down. People are starving, miserable. This makes it easier for workers to empathize with one another as a class and to organize themselves. Thus, Marx says that with the development of industry, the proletariat not only increases in number, it becomes concentrated in greater masses. Its strength grows, and it feels that strength more. The various interests and conditions of life within the ranks of the proletariat are more and more equalized, in proportion as machinery obliterates all distinctions of labor and nearly everywhere reduces wages to the same low level. Once workers are aware of their common condition, Marx predicts that they will organize together and overthrow the capitalist mode of production and usher in the future, communism. Now, the main point I want you to take away from this presentation is that capitalism is a unique mode of production that has only existed for a small fraction of human history, a mere 400 years. It is not how things have always been. It is not inevitable. Something else came before, and something else will come after.